So I'm talking with a couple, and they're telling me about some friends of theirs. And they were telling me that their friends used to have the same kind of faith that this couple has, and actively pursued a relationship with Christ, involved in their church, and so on. But as the years had come and gone, this couple had wandered away from their faith. In fact, made some intentional decisions just to kind of throw the towel in. And in their conversation with each other, these two couples, the couple that was talking to me said, what they decided was that it no longer made any sense to them. That it was just a little too out there. And in the process, they'd been reading and learning and discovering things in science and philosophy and talking to some friends about creation versus evolution and learning some things about archaeology and different things. And they just began to put all that out on the table and said, faith no longer makes any sense. We're out. Now, that was, of course, disappointing to the couple, and they were expressing they were lamenting that and expressing their frustration with the fact that that was actually what had happened, but they were also expressing their frustration with the fact that they didn't really know what to say. It's like, we had this conversation, it's just like I didn't know what to say to them. It's like, I believe, I'm sorry you don't believe, but I still do. And like we didn't know how to address any of their concerns. And that conversation illustrates the twofold purpose for this entire series, False God. In other words, we want to help people, you might be one of them, who are at the point where they're beginning to wonder if it really makes any sense anymore. They're beginning to wonder if their faith really is something that they want to continue to embrace and develop, and a relationship with God, something they want to pursue, or if they're going to just throw the towel in. And we want to help people that are in that space realize that often what they're doing is they're considering throwing the towel in on a false God, a caricature, a representation of God that's not really accurate. And then we're also wanting through this series to equip you. If you're one of those individuals who, for you, it's settled and you have a pretty clear idea of the God you believe in and what the Scripture says about Him, and your faith is stable and established and you're not really questioning it, you're going to have conversations with people who are questioning their faith, and we want to help you be better at helping them. And so these twofold objectives have been the underlying premise for this entire series. And we've said it this way: a grade school faith is no match for grown-up challenges. That's what happens when we don't continue to develop our faith and deepen our faith and grow in our faith when real life happens, when unexpected things happen, when tragic things happen that don't quite fit within the parameters of our faith, and our faith is challenged. We need to have the kind of faith that can withstand those kinds of challenges. And not only do we need that for ourselves, but we want to be able to help others. In other words, we want to present God as He truly is, not a caricature of what He is like. Something that kind of sort of looks like Him, sort of seems like Him, has elements of truth, but isn't really a very clear image. And if you've missed any of the weeks, they're all available on our website and on the app. We encourage you to check them out, watch them in their entirety. Today, we're talking about simple-minded God. Simple-minded God. And I define it this way: simple-minded God is the God who is easily explained away by science, logic, history, and plain old common sense. I mean, seriously, right? You don't really believe that stuff in the Bible, do you? I've heard that I don't know how many times over the years from very intelligent, otherwise really nice people, but they challenge my faith and say to me, hey, you really don't believe that nonsense? Like, the implication is like, what kind of an idiot are you, Craig? Like, clearly, science, logic, history, and plain old common sense says that stuff you believe, that Bible that's full of fables and myths, that faith that you have in a God that doesn't really exist, like, that's nonsense. And we want to address that issue here today, again, to help strengthen the faith that we have, get the roots down deeper, and be equipped to help other people who are asking serious questions that actually deserve to be asked and responded to. See, I think we unnecessarily create a tension or a polarization between facts and faith. Let me explain what I mean. We say, well, the fact is, science says this. The fact is, history says this. The fact is, geologists have discovered this. And we look at things that are presented as fact, in our world today, and the amount of knowledge not only available to us on the internet, but the amount of knowledge that's just generally being amassed by our world is growing exponentially. It's just all kinds of information out there. So people look at facts and they say, well, the facts seem to say this, but my faith seems to say that, and I somehow need to make a choice between the two. That somehow facts, science, logic, history, archaeology, whatever it is, facts somehow are the threat to my faith or an enemy to my faith, that somehow the two don't mix. And I don't know how many times I've had the kind of conversation that tells me that the person I'm talking with often is caught in that tension between those two. It's like I'm trying to decide, and I was over here, now I'm over here, and I'm wondering if I'm going to go. And that's an artificial tension. That's an artificial, unnecessary polarization. Let me put it to you this way. Faith in Jesus does not require us to commit intellectual suicide. Faith is a step that is plausible, sensible, and reasoned. When I was in high school, I graduated top of my class. When I was in Bible college, I graduated top of my class. I am a thinker, and I am someone who asks questions, and my faith in Jesus Christ has been subjected to a lot of questions over the years. Now, I gave my heart to Christ at age 19. It was a step that I took that was meaningful and significant, and my life really began to change in some dramatic ways. But as I went through the first couple of years and then on into Bible college, years 3 through 6, I began to ask serious questions. And I was at a point where I put my faith on the table and said, if I'm going to continue to believe this stuff, yeah, I've had some meaningful experiences. Yeah, I'm pretty sure God exists and Jesus is his son. And yeah, I'm pretty sure my life has changed because of my faith, but I'm not sure I want to continue. So I put my faith on the table and I said, if Jesus is real, if God is real, if the Bible is trustworthy, if my faith is something that I should continue to embrace and a relationship with Christ, something I should continue to pursue, then it will withstand the test of my questions. And so I began to ask hard questions. I drove my wife nuts during that time period because for her it's a much simpler process. For her faith is a much more settled thing, and she's not as prone to ask and answer questions and grapple with issues and analyze and intellectualize her faith near as much as me. I often have prayed, Lord, make me more like Cindy. But I'm not that person, right? And maybe you're like my wife, and for you it's just like, yeah, you're talking about something that's really not a challenge for me. Great, I'm glad that you're like my wife. But there are people like me in the world, and maybe you are one of those who are sitting here today, but if not, you know somebody. Somebody in your sphere of influence is a thinker and an analyzer and somebody who asks questions and who wants their faith to be able to withstand the scrutiny of an intellectual process. In other words, if they're going to believe in Jesus Christ, it needs to be plausible, sensible, and reasoned. Now, it doesn't take away the fact that it's a step of faith. I'm still going to take a step of faith and trust God. Some of you were worried I was going to step right off of here. I'm going to take that step of faith, but it's not a step into the unknown or oblivion. It's not a leap off of the cliff like it might be if I stepped off there. It's a more reasoned step. It's like there's a reason to believe in God. There's a reason to believe in Jesus Christ. There's a reason to believe that he came and lived and died and rose from the dead, that the tomb is actually empty, and my faith in him is actually something that makes sense. It's still faith, but it's more like walking down these steps. Yeah, which apparently I've had a little too much to drink this morning. I'm not sure what was going on there. Right? Faith in Jesus does not require us to commit intellectual suicide. Faith is a step that is plausible, sensible, and reasoned. This is what Jesus is referring to when he says, when you love God, love him with all your soul, with all your heart, with all your strength, and with all your, some of you know this, mind. In the world that we're living in today, as Christ followers, we who are Christ followers can't afford to be lazy thinkers. We just can't. Even if it's not for our sake, even if delving into some of the stuff we're talking about here today isn't something we're motivated for, we should, as representatives and ambassadors of Christ, do our part to be diligent in diving into some of this. So today, we're going to talk about this whole idea that I don't have to commit intellectual suicide. when it comes to science, logic, and history. So let's just jump right into science. Science and God are not mutually exclusive considerations. We do not have to pick between the two. Science and God. They're not mutually exclusive. They're not even enemies of each other. As a matter of fact, everything in science points to God. Everything that scientists are discovering as they get more and more insight into how this world works, how the laws of physics work, how the solar system works, how quantum physics works, how biology works, all of the things that scientists are discovering actually point to the brilliance of the one who alone is responsible for its complexities. Are you impressed like I am by astronomy? Like mind-blowing, all the galaxies and the billions of stars and the distances and all the stuff that goes, like that's mind-blowing to me. And what it does for me is point my heart to the one who alone is responsible for all of that. In other words, I don't have to say, well, the Big Bang and all the solar and the galaxies and it all came from that and that really doesn't involve God. I don't need God. I'm just going to believe in the Big Bang. No, all of that stuff there, however it came about, whatever the history of the beginning of the galaxy is all about and how it's to be understood, as we're delving into that and discovering all that, all it does is just point me all the more to the one who's responsible for all of that. Same thing with human anatomy. Amazing. We're fearfully and wonderfully made. There's such intelligent design and complexity in our human bodies that even when things aren't quite like we'd like them to be or what we'd consider normal, there's just amazing complexity in the human body, and the fact that that comes from 2 single cells is a miracle. This points me to the one who had the idea to have chromosomes and DNA be the code from which that miraculous reproduction would spring. Now, I don't have enough time. I have enough interest. I could bore you to tears and we could spend hours here diving into some of the stuff that in science we're discovering that points us to God, that supports the idea of intelligent design, that actually negates the theory, and it is a theory, of evolution. But I just wanted to pick one thing. I've been fascinated by quantum physics, and Albert Einstein is one who's kind of paved the way to modern studies in the area of quantum mechanics and quantum physics, and it's commonly accepted and understood that there are 4 primary forces in the universe. One is gravity, one's electromagnetism, and those are 2 that we experience on a regular basis. But the other 2 you may not have heard about, and you don't experience on a regular basis, or do you? One is the weak force, and the other is the strong force. The weak force has to do with the decay, at an atomic level, the decay of the elements of the universe. I don't really get that, but that's what they tell us. The strong force is this interesting thing that keeps the protons in the nucleus of every atom from rejecting one another and pushing apart. Because they're both positive. You know what happens when you take the positive end of a magnet and the positive end of another magnet and try to get them to go together? What do? They want to repel each other, and the protons in the nucleus of an atom, of every atom, are much the same way. But the scientists tell us that the reason they don't just blow apart and in the process blow everything that we know in existence into oblivion, the reason they don't is because of the strong force. Well, what's the strong force? Or rather, who is the strong force? Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 says this about Jesus. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. If your view or perception of Jesus is that he was a nice man who lived back when and encouraged us to live in a similar fashion and be more kind and loving toward one another, but that's all you're perceiving of him, you're missing a big part of who he is. He did give us an example to follow. but he also died on the cross, and he also rose again, and he also offers us a grace that is the only way by which we're going to have a relationship with him and with the Father, and the only way we're going to spend eternity with him in heaven. And yet, even beyond all of that, he's the one who made everything. He's the one for whom everything was made. He's the one in whom everything actually exists. Let's read on. Watch this next verse. He is before all things. So whatever it is, Jesus was before that. And in him, look at this, all things hold together. There's another verse in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 that alludes to the very same thing, that everything is held together by the word of his power. What's the strong force? What's holding the atoms together and keeps them from just going, Jesus. And I can embrace science. I love quantum mechanics and quantum physics and the stuff that I don't really understand, but I am fascinated by. I love all that because all it does is point me to the one who's the strong force, the one who designed all that, who created those four forces and the structure of atoms and the nature of the universe. All that stuff's just fascinating. There's no tension between science and God. There's no tension between facts and faith. The facts support my faith. The facts encourage my faith. And every once in a while, scientists discover they've been wrong about stuff. Imagine that. What a shock. They once thought the sun went around the earth. They once thought the earth was flat. They once thought that atoms were the smallest particles. Then they discovered that the atoms were consisting of smaller particles. Then they thought that was it. Now they're finding there's even smaller particles. They used to think the speed of light was constant. Now they're beginning to question even that. Science is an evolving process of discovery of the complexities of the one who made it all. And here's the other thing about science, in case you're still a bit of a skeptic, or you're talking with someone who says, evolution's a fact, it's not a theory. There isn't a God who made all this, it's the Big Bang. Understand this about science. The scientific method requires that data in support of a hypothesis be confirmed through observable testing. In other words, if we can recreate it and then recreate it again, and it happens over and over, or we can observe it in nature again and again and again, then we have observation of things that are happening, and that supports the hypothesis or the theory. But up till that point, it's just a theory, and there is no way to go all the way back, no matter what the evidence suggests as they look at what's going on in science. There's no way to go back and actually confirm that the Big Bang, as they are hypothesizing, actually happened the way that they did. The same thing is true with evolution. In the absence of intermediary species that they assume must have existed, but they don't have any ability to observe. In other words, it's not scientific to believe in evolution. It is not scientific to believe in the Big Bang. It is scientism, which is a whole different thing, because it's not possible to actually confirm the hypothesis. In other words, it takes faith to believe in those things. And it's actually less faith that is required to believe in a God who, through intelligent design and actual purpose, created all things with something in mind. It takes less faith to believe that than that we're all the product of some random collision of cosmic forces that somehow or the other produced everything that we have right now. We were just this morning talking about how Siri recognizes your voice. Some of you, who's Siri? You don't have a smartphone probably, or haven't been paying attention. But anyway, it's the voice recognition software that is responsible for voice to text on your smartphone, that is behind Alexa and Siri and all that. It's the ability of the computer to analyze, that's in the device, to analyze the sound waves of your voice and to either convert that to text or respond to that in some way. Fascinating, right? And all the languages on earth that have this, I mean, they spent a ridiculous amount of time and effort developing the software, programming all those possibilities in there, compiling all that data. I mean, millions and millions of lines of code and all of the time and man hours spent to compile all that. And all of that right here on a device like this. I can say, hey, Siri, and Siri will respond to me, right? Now, I can be impressed with that, and I am, and just leave it at that. Or I can be impressed with that and say, how amazing are the men and women who created all that? Because all of that is just the byproduct of their brilliance. Everything in science is just the byproduct of God's creative brilliance. All right, let's move on from science to logic. Logic and God, like science and God, are not mutually exclusive considerations. In other words, we do not have to pick between the two. Faith is not the opposite of logic. Logic does not necessarily, although sometimes it does, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a problem or a hindrance to the expression of my faith. As a matter of fact, the two can go hand in hand quite well. And this has to do, again, with the same fundamental premise, that human intellect points to the brilliance of the one who alone is responsible for the human capacity for thought. Have you seen a brain? No, I mean not in person. Hopefully you haven't seen a brain in person. But have you seen like a picture or a video when they show the human brain, the gray matter that constitutes our brain? Do you know, for all that we understand about the human body and how it functions and all that, the human brain is still a mystery. As much as they know about it and how the centers of the brain are responsible for different things and creative thought and speech and all the rest of it, they still don't get how a cell remembers stuff. How a cell can extrapolate and do analytical thought and come to a conclusion. How cells working together with neurons firing can produce all that. It's beyond scientists' ability to fully comprehend. They're exploring it, they're discovering it, but your brain is this amazing, organic thing. And the capacity for thought and speech and the ability to listen to what I'm saying right now and make sense out of it, and all that's going on with our brains every day, all of it just points me to the one who had the brilliant idea of making our brain like it is. Like, how good is he? Like, how awesome is that? I mean, the human brain is just one of those areas where I just think, like, God was just showing off. Like, I'll create a bunch of cells and nerves and I'll wad them all up in a big ball. And I think just so it's not particularly impressive, I'll just make it gray. And then I'll put it in human beings. Amazing. See, in our thought processes, we run with logic, and along with that, I would say philosophy and a lot of other intellectual endeavors, that in the exercise of this wonderful God-given capacity for thought, we run a serious danger. And it's the danger that has been a part of every one of our messages in this series. It's the danger of arrogance. With bodyguard gods, like, I'm going to tell God how he should protect me. With on-demand God, I'm going to tell God how he should respond to my requests, and so on, right? And it's arrogant of us, the creation, to think that we would dictate to the Creator how it works. And this is the problem Job had. And here's what God said to Job at the end of a very long and very difficult experience. Job 38, verse 1, then the Lord spoke to Job out of the storm. I think it's interesting that that's how the Lord spoke to him, out of the storm. And here's what he said. God's just talking to Job. Now watch the sarcasm, if that's what you call it. I don't know. When God gets sarcastic, is it sarcastic? I don't know. Who is this, Job, that it obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. All right, Job, stand up, look me in the eye, and get ready. I will question you, and you're going to answer. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. In other words, before you ever were a thought, I created everything, And you weren't there. I was. You weren't. But if you're so smart, tell me, where were you when I was doing all of that? And of course, that's a rhetorical question. The question implies the answer. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know, Job, you're that smart. I mean, you're intellectually superior to all the people you know. It's like, I'm sure you have. The sarcasm just amazes me. Surely you know. Who stretched out a measuring line and crossed it? And then God goes on, verse after verse. There's actually 2 chapters worth of these rhetorical questions, basically God dressing Job down because of his arrogance. Well, let's read a few of them. It goes on in Job 40, verses 1 and 2. The Lord said to Job, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Are you going to correct me? How many times when you're praying do you realize what you're doing is correcting God? Like, I prayed for this, God, you did this instead. I want you to fix it. Right? Let's be honest. Let him who accuses God answer him. Brace yourself like a man. Here it comes again. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Would you discredit my justice? Job is telling God how justice should look. Job is telling God how justice should play out, and God's calling him on it. Would you condemn me just to justify yourself? So you're going to find fault with me so you can make yourself look better? How many times do we do that? Sometimes I get done praying and I think, why did I bother? Because all I'm doing is telling God how it should be and finding fault with him so I look better. But God continues with Job. Do you have an arm like God's? Like if you're so strong, if you're so smart, and can your voice thunder like his? Well, it goes on after that, and finally Job gets the idea, and he humbles himself, and then God blesses him immensely, and it's a wonderful ending to that story. But the issue is that he allowed, like so often happens in our human experiences, he allowed his intellectual thought process to get away from him and become arrogant. And as soon as arrogance is there, the knowledge of God begins to go away. It's through humility. Like, Lord, I have the capacity for thought. I think I'm asking pretty good questions. But, Lord, I recognize that you're smarter than me, wiser than me, more brilliant than me, and so I'm going to humble myself before you. I would like you to instruct me. I'd like you to teach me. I'd like you to help me understand, because my pea brain, as brilliant and sophisticated as it is from a human standpoint, is nothing compared to your knowledge and wisdom. All right, science, logic. Let's take a quick look at history. History and God are not mutually exclusive considerations. We do not have to pick between the two. History as well points to the brilliance of the one who is unfolding his purposes in human history. Our small group curriculum right now is taking us through the story of God's redemptive purposes from Genesis through Revelation, from before Scripture actually existed, when before all things Jesus was, and then he created all things for his own sake, and then what happened after that, and how God through human history is going to bring restoration to all the things that he originally intended that we messed up, but he's in the process of fixing. And it's a wonderful story of a God who is at work in human history in amazing ways that still don't violate human free will and the choices that we make, that are filled with his patient waiting on us to figure it out. God is so patient. So patient. And with respect to history, one of the areas that has been a particular challenge over the years is what in archaeology they discover about things that are mentioned in the Bible, or that are mentioned in the Bible but don't show up in archaeology. And once again, there's just a wealth of information out on the internet and in books, and it's accessible to you. And I would encourage you to, if you're interested even in the slightest, to look into it. I just pulled a few snippets from a few articles that I read in this regard, which I think are fascinating. And I just want to read a few lines here. It has been fashionable in some circles for many years to ridicule Isaiah 20, verse 1, for its allusion to, quote, Sargon, king of Assyria. Excavations of Nineveh has seemingly revealed all the kings of Syria, but there was no Sargon. So the Bible must have gotten it wrong, the critics have said, for generations. However, in 1843, they found a new site near Nineveh, and they discovered that Sargon had actually built his own capital there in 717 BC, and the details of this discovery were published in the 1930s. His son, it turns out, the son of Sargon, moved the capital back to Nineveh after Sargon had built his own place in that location. And it says that the site was lost as a result, and as well Sargon's name. Now Sargon is one of the best known Assyrian monarchs. In the same way, the Bible contended that King Belshazzar was the final ruler of Babylon. But until AD 1929, it was understood that that was an error in the Bible. This apparent conflict, however, was solved when documents were discovered revealing that another king spent his time in Arabia, leaving the affairs of the kingdom to his eldest son Belshazzar, who reigned as co-regent for a decade or so. Oh, once again, the Bible is corroborated as being historically accurate, but not until further discoveries were made. And then one more. I just love this one. So until Hugo Winkler discovered the Hittite Empire in 1906, many unbelievers doubted the Bible's insistence that the Hittites were part of the land of Canaan. You probably, if you've read any of the Old Testament, run across that. Now the Hittites, are so well documented that a score of volumes have been necessary to build a Hittite dictionary based on the tablets that were left of their civilization. As a matter of fact, this mystery group has been proven to be, indeed, a group that existed, and the Bible, once again, proven to be accurate. There are so many things like that you can dive into and explore and learn about, but the point is that as archaeology goes forward, as more discoveries are made, once again, it points to the brilliance of the one who is alone unfolding his purpose in human history, and it corroborates the biblical account as historically accurate. Now, I mentioned that because I want to just end with this. And this is the thing that empowered, that drove the early church, and we've kind of moved away from it a little bit. And that's this. The resurrection is the historical fact that was the basis of the faith of the early disciples. I just want you to insert yourself for a moment into this scenario that played out in their lives. They meet this man, Jesus, who fulfills prophecy and claims to be the Messiah, and they decide that just might be true. And they follow him for 3 years. Then he dies and they're disillusioned. Then he rises from the dead and they're restored in their relationship with him. And they see that the tomb is empty and that he is alive. And then he appears to them for 40 days. And then they're there when he disappears up into heaven. This one they put their hopes and dreams in. This one they put their faith in. This one that they confided in and followed for those 3 years has been resurrected from the dead just like he predicted he would. And that prediction and its fulfillment substantiated every other thing he ever taught or every other claim he ever made. And they are not about to be moved away from that reality. You can persecute them, and they were persecuted, but they're going to hold to their faith. You can cause them to become martyrs, and they all were martyred, the original disciples, but that did not deter them from hanging on to their faith. Why? Because they knew that the tomb was empty, and this person, Jesus, actually rose from the dead like he said he would. And we've kind of, taken the resurrection and kind of put it into Easter, when it's an historical fact. See, what we're talking about here is another subject that we don't even have time to dive into in great depth, but is the Bible a reliable historical document? And I just was talking about some of the examples of why we can believe that that's true because of the historical things that it says that have been corroborated by other sources. But if that's then true, then Jesus really lived, and he really said the things he said, and he really did the things he did, and he really predicted his own death, and he really went to the cross, and he really went to the grave, and he really rose from the dead, and therefore the implications for my life are enormous. History doesn't undermine my faith, it supports it. Archaeology doesn't challenge my faith, it strengthens it. I don't have to be afraid of asking and answering questions. I don't have to be afraid of engaging in conversation with people who say, yeah, I'm not sure if I buy all that. Well, tell me why you believe that, and let's have a conversation. We far too often have been sort of simple-minded in our approach. It's like, hey, God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. In other words, I'm not open to conversation or questions, but if we'll open ourselves up, not only will our faith be strengthened, but we'll be equipped to help other people who are asking those same questions and challenged by those same things and are working through these same processes that we've talked about here today. Well, I'm impressed with God. Paul, one of the human authors of a big portion of the New Testament and one of the early leaders of the church, Paul was a very intelligent man, trained in some of the best universities. Even Peter, in one of his letters, says about Paul that some of the stuff Paul says is hard for Peter to understand. I mean, Paul was very academically intelligent and well-educated. And here's what he says about how much smarter God is. Romans 11. Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor? Who has ever given to God that God should repay them? For from him and through him and for him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. That's an intelligent man coming to that conclusion in all of his education and all of his life experiences. All of that supported a faith in Jesus Christ that was strong and unshakable to the time of his death. I want to follow that example. I want to be diligent to know him, which means loving him with my mind. And I want to be diligent in making him known to others, which means I need to be open to have the kinds of conversations with people that we've been talking about here today. If you and I do that, our strength will be strong, and we won't be packing it in years from now or wandering away from our faith in Christ, but we'll also be used by God to help other people come to faith in Christ who are asking questions and they're just looking for somebody who doesn't have this caricature view of God, this simple-minded God, but who's willing to ask and talk intelligently about some of the things that they're struggling with so that they can come to faith. That's what I want to be about. I want us all to be about that. I hope you'll join me in that. Let's pray.